All right, everybody, by my clock, it looks like it is the top of the hour. So it looks like we are ready to get started. And as I just mentioned, a big welcome to you all from all around the world. My name is Jennifer, and in collaboration with my Learning A to Z colleagues, we are thrilled to have you in attendance for our International Speakers Series event, Connecting Global Voices. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to go over a few items that will help ensure the success of our event. First, there are a few features on our Zoom platform that we want you to be aware of. You should see your Zoom dashboard that looks similar to what you're seeing on my screen. To ensure we don't have any background noise, please make sure that your microphone remains muted at all times. Also, if you would like to be on your video, you are welcome to do so. I know that it helps us all to connect, especially when we're in a distance learning setting. However, if the video inhibits your bandwidth or your experience in any way, you can feel free to leave that off. What we do hope that you take advantage of today, as we've already been doing, is the chat box. Please feel free throughout the duration of our session today to ask questions in the chat box, provide your own input and expertise, make comments. Please feel free to engage. Also, know that this session is being recorded and that the recording will be available after our session today if you would like to review it or to share it with any of your colleagues. And finally, we know that with technology, we sometimes run into some troubleshooting issues. If you run into any problems with Zoom, there is a link up at the top of my screen that you might want to make note of. I also have my colleagues that are going to be monitoring the chat. And if you run into any problems, they are there to assist you the best that they can. Also, throughout our session today, I'd like to remind us all of our responsibilities we have as digital learners, leaders, citizens, and collaborators. As a good-sized group, our moderators will do their best to monitor that chat, but we also encourage professional and respectful engagement between attendees. Remember also, if you run into technical difficulties, please feel free to refer to that link I just mentioned on the last slide, and we'll also put that link in the chat box if needed. Now, on behalf of Learning A to Z's International Speaker Series, Connecting Global Voices, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Pytash. Dr. Pytash is an associate professor in teaching, learning, and curriculum studies at the College of Education, Health, and Human Services at Kent State University in the US. While she began her career as a high school English teacher, she now directs the Secondary Integrated Language Arts Teacher Preparation Program at Kent State. Dr. Pytash's research focuses on the literacy practices of youth and juvenile detention facilities. In addition, she studies disciplinary writing and how to prepare teachers to teach writing. An underlying theme across all of Dr. Pytash's line of inquiry is how technology significantly influences young adults' literacy practices and their literacy instruction. Dr. Pytash is a regular contributor to the International Literacy Association's Tile SIG blog and was the 2017 recipient of the Riwe Bell English Award for outstanding service relating to the role and image of women in English education, sponsored by the National Council of Teachers of English, Gender, and Literacy Assembly. Please put your hands together and help me welcome my colleague, mentor, and dear friend, Dr. Christine Pytash. Dr. Pytash, I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass the controls over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. If you can just give me one moment to share my screen and then we can go ahead and get started. I'm so excited to talk to you today about writing instruction because as a teacher and as a teacher educator, it is a topic that I'm very passionate about. You know, when I taught high school, I thought writing instruction was so challenging because you are trying to teach students a particular skill while honoring their voice and their experiences. And so it sort of became my passion to learn more about writing instruction, effective writing instruction, and specifically how technology shapes what we do in the classroom. So our agenda for today, we're going to first start off by just talking about evidence-based writing instruction at large. What are the best practices for teaching writing, either print-based writing or using digital tools? Once from there, we're going to talk about we have four sections. So the first is reimagining writing, revisioning writing, digital tools for publishing, and preparing students for writing. So we're going to first start off by talking about evidence-based practices and what this really means. So we know that writing instruction should develop students as writers. Okay, so not just even thinking about their abilities, but we want students to be passionate about writing. We want them to have confidence as a writer, and we want them to realize that they can persist, because there are times that writing is very challenging for all of us. And so when we develop students as writers, it's not just their abilities, but it's how their dispositions towards writing and how they feel about themselves as writers. We want writing instruction to be authentic, and we're going to talk about what that actually means, because we hear that so much in education, that our instruction should be authentic. But what is writing instruction, authentic writing instruction, what does that look like? What does that actually mean? The next thing we're going to talk about, and this is going to be very important, is how we establish purpose and audience for students. So really what's interesting in research is that when students understand why they're writing and who will be reading their writing, they are more effective writers. So all of the instructional tools and ideas that I'm going to share today, we are going to keep coming back to this idea of how they establish purpose and how they establish audience. And then again, we want students to have choice in their writing. And typically this comes from topic and allowing students to sort of explore the things that they're interested in their writing. So as we think about all of these things that writing instruction should be, we're going to talk a little bit about writer-based prose versus reader-based prose. And they're both very important topics in writing instruction. So if I am journaling, or if I'm writing a grocery store list, right? I'm writing that for myself. I'm not expecting anyone else to be able to read it, to necessarily interpret it. And that's writing-based prose. But we also want students to be in the mind frame of reader-based prose, meaning they're writing and somebody else can read what they're writing and understand it. And that's where that idea of purpose and audience really comes into play. So how do we teach students, and how does our instruction framed so that students are thinking past themselves and thinking about who is going to actually read their writing? So how do we do this? So one of the ways that we help students is by teaching them to read like a writer. And when we teach students to read like a writer, what we're asking them to do is to deconstruct writing, to think and study writing, so that they can see the important elements, what makes a good piece of writing. So I'm going to show you what this actually means. So when I'm asking students to read like a writer, and what's important about this, let me go back for a moment, is that when I'm asking students to read like a writer, I do this whether I am teaching print-based writing, I do this whether I'm using digital tools for writing. So all of my instruction is framed from this idea that we want to teach students to read like a writer. So the way that I do this is that I first start off by picking a specific genre. And a genre is a type of writing. So if everyone could just think in the chat, what are some of the genres that you read on a daily basis? Maybe it's an opinion essay or a memoir. I'm going to give everyone about 30 seconds to think about some of the genres that you either teach or that you read on a daily basis. historical writing, lists, emails, news articles, stories. And we can even be very narrative stories. We can be really specific, right? So we read maybe a persuasive essay or news article, a blog, a narrative opinion, advertisements. We're going to talk about advertisements and infographics today as well. Descriptive writing, recounting of events, right? So all of these are genres that we can use in the classroom. Scientific articles on the virus. I think we're all reading a lot of that right now. So once we have identified the genre that we want to teach students, the next thing that we do is that we gather a lot of high quality texts. So we pick our favorite authors, or we pick texts that are really kind of well-written pieces, and we gather those together. And I usually probably pick 5 to 6 pieces of text. Once we have all those texts, then we read them and we start talking to students. Oh, I really noticed that when I listen to this podcast, there's always a hook. There's something that sort of draws me in that makes me want to keep listening to this particular podcast. Or we say, okay, you know, when there's procedural writing, I sort of notice that the author says first and second and third and finally, that there are these there are these different types of transitional words. Once we start kind of reading the articles or reading the genre and sort of immerse ourselves in it, then I start thinking about a close study. I pick 1 or 2 exemplary texts that are really very important, and I closely go through them with students. I model it first. I talk to them. I say, okay, this is what I'm noticing. This is what I'm paying attention to. This is what I think this author does really well. And then I ask students to do that together in groups. And then finally, they do that independently, so that by the end of our close study, they really have a sense of the important elements of the genre and also what makes a good piece of writing. So I saw in the chat, how do you gather and share your text? Well, I do this in lots of different ways. So if I was face-to-face in a classroom, maybe I would have print. Google Drive is probably one of my favorite tools for doing this, right? So I might gather pieces of text, have them in Google Drive, and then we can use the tools to go through them and annotate them together. Once you have immersed students in the text, then they're ready to get writing. And usually I will show you a picture in a little bit. I kind of post these so that students can always refer back to these important elements. And I saw someone says class notebooks, and we're going to talk about digital notebooks later in this later in the presentation, because that's a great tool as well. Oops. Okay. So I think about this in terms of what students, how we are teaching students to look at a piece of text. And I use this piece of construction, right? So we always see the end result, right? We see the beautiful house and the landscaping, but we are trying to teach students how we got there. So when we can immerse them in text and do these deconstructions, they get to see the structure. They get to see how an author actually crafts a piece of writing. So here's an example. Flash fiction is a very short genre. It is 500 words or less, and it is a story, so it's narrative writing. And here's just an example of the things that I used when I was teaching flash fiction. And then you can see the image of the board where we were listing all of our close noticings, right? So we're talking about here, oh, I noticed there's a twist. Oh, I noticed they use really descriptive words. So we're coming together and collaboratively, working to kind of create our noticings. Okay, so thinking about this idea of reading like a writer, I want you to think about what could be some of the benefits to teaching students to read like a writer. And I know I mentioned a few, but are there other things that you can think about? So thinking about that process, gathering text, immersing students in text, going through a close analysis of a few texts, and then asking students to do independent writing. Right. It picks out so many of the features, the elements that students typically, even I would think about, there are things that I kind of skim over once I'm starting to read a piece, right? Building vocabulary. Vocabulary is so important, and teaching students really descriptive language and why, what works well. So if you're doing a procedure, you have to, if you're reading procedural writing, it has to be really clearly laid out. But if you are writing narratively, maybe you want figurative language. Yes, definitely making it explicit for students, thinking of the grammatical structures, the rhetorical structures. So all of these are really great ways to think about why we need to teach students to read like writers. So again, this is the framework that I use for every single unit when I'm teaching writing, whether I'm working with college age students or just yesterday, I was in an 8th grade classroom working with 8th graders on podcasts. Across the board, no matter what age, this is always how I'm thinking of teaching students to read like a writer. And you're going to see a range of examples. I saw someone mention kids like grades 3 and lower. And so I'm going to show you a few examples from early childhood as well. So the first type of writing today we're going to talk about is multimodal compositions. When you think about multimodal, we're thinking about modes. And so a mode is an image, audio, gesture, it's any print, it's any way that we are communicating with somebody else. So multimodal is when we put it all together. And so that we have maybe something like a photo essay or an iMovie. That is a multimodal composition where you're using audio and video together. So the research has shown that when we are using multimodal writing, students are pretty much used to reading on a screen, right? Or they're used to print, they're used to visual. And so we're incorporating students' personal literacies. We're also giving them a chance to reimagine what writing instruction could be. And interestingly enough, with the struggling writers, we have actually found that when they are using multi-modes to compose, they become more strategic. So it's interesting to think about how we teach students to work together and think about the affordances of different types of modes. So what does this actually mean though for our instruction? So I'm going to talk today about 3 different types of assignments that are multimodal that I have done with my students. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one, and I'm going to give you a student example as well. So the first is kinetic poetry. And I love kinetic poetry because students are always so engaged when we do this. And kinetic poetry is actually poetry in motion. So it is using different tools so that the words on the screen actually move. And what's really interesting about this is when you take the time to then talk to students about their decision making. So why they chose to have certain words highlighted or certain words in a particular color or to have certain words move. So let me show you an example so that you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. And then we're going to come back and talk more about why this is so effective. Okay. So in that particular example, the students were they were studying Mary Oliver. They were studying poetry. And so in this particular poem, they took a section of Mary Oliver's poem and they used PowerPoint. PowerPoint is actually it's a great tool for actually making kinetic poetry. And they then use PowerPoint to animate the poem. So when you think about that, all the things that they're having to do, they're having to really analyze the poem. They're having to think about why, how the author was phrasing certain things, the meaning, if there's figurative language, any other literary elements that is in the poem that they want to highlight. At the same time, you could also have students write their own original poems and then have them create kinetic poetry as well. But where we see this is, the different modes with the image in the background, the thinking of the words that are highlighted or moving, and how this all comes together to tell a particular story. So the next assignment that I'm going to talk about, and then I promise I'm going to give time in the chat to kind of think about these assignments and how they go together, is what's called the HyperText Composition. So if you think about when you hypertext something, when you link it to something else, this is basically what this assignment does, is that you have students write a composition, you have students have a piece of writing, and then you use different modes. You hypertext different modes to particular words for, again, them to highlight certain things within their writing. So again, I'm going to show you an example and then talk a little bit about it, and then give you a chance to think about how hypertext and kinetic poetry sort of can engage students in thinking deeply about their writing. Okay. Let me see.
There he is. Where? On the ice shelf. So alert in the winter there. Oh, look, now, another one, emerging from the water onto the winter's icy cover. Charcoal, fur, sleek and shine, gray face whiskered, and white-bellied, quick paws, quick pig. Near the water's edge, preening on their backs, in the snow they pause. We've been into the water, soundless we wait. We wait, there are not to be found.
Okay. Okay, so with that hypertext, that was a 4th grade student. That was an original poem that he wrote about otters. And then he went and found pictures of otters, highlighted the important phrases in his poem, the things he thought were very important, and then linked pictures to those particular words or phrases. So again, this is done in PowerPoint. You can have students create home slides, and then PowerPoint actually allows you to link to videos and other slides and other, and images and other slides. So again, by just using PowerPoint, which is a seemingly simple tool, or Google Slides does the same, you can think about how students can really do a deep analysis of their writing, and how having them use certain modes like visual helps us think more deeply and helps them think more deeply about the text and what they're trying to share. So again, you're integrating these multiple modes and you're visually appealing to the particular audience that they're writing for. His raspy little voice. I know. I love working with little ones sometimes because they are so sweet and cute. So thoughts about kinetic poetry and hypertext compositions. Just give everyone a minute to think about in the chat. It definitely allows students to be creative. They love picking out the pictures, especially to go through their poems. They love thinking about, and that's a really great point too. The visual does allow for deeper understanding. So you can think about, if I would go back, he talked about the otter on his back, and then, or what the lake looked like, the winter. So they have to really think about, well, how does this image represent the words that I wrote? And then talking to them about that, right? So thinking about, okay, so this is what I was thinking as a writer, and here has this visual really shows that, right? So the visual becomes the text. And they are thinking definitely like writers and as teachers. I'm just reading, right, the hypertext, other slides. It does help students really think about their audience, because they have to really think about, again, how their visual shows what they're trying to say. And it's actually could also be a revision strategy where they, as they start to go through their trying to find pictures, they go with their words, they think, okay, actually, that's really not what I wanted to say, or I want to make this a little bit different. So we have one more type of multimodal composition that we are going to talk about right now. And this is infographics. So infographics are so interesting to me because, again, students have to visually represent their words. They have to visually represent the information. And it's a great way to teach students for evidence-based writing. So I have a few examples here. And these are all very different examples. Some of them are from a pre-service teacher, their reflections on teaching writing. And then the last one you can see is on a book called Maze Runner. So in this particular one, it was a great way to teach students how to respond to literature, because they had to take elements of the book and then think about why they are going to represent pieces of the book in particular ways. And so you can see one of the images is of a maze, the characters. So you can use infographics in lots of different ways as a standalone composition or as a response to literature, where students are having to visually represent their understanding of a particular text. So infographics they're incredibly important. You think about most of us, if we pick up our phones, if we're looking at the news, if we're on social media, so much of what we are reading now is visually represented. So there's two parts here. One is teaching students to compose in those particular ways. And then the other is teaching students, how do we read these types of texts? And that's the idea, again, of that reader-based prose. How do we deconstruct these images? How do we make sense of these images? Why did the author choose to represent this in a particular graph or pie chart, or however they chose to do that? So that we can really get students to be analytical writers and also analytical readers of particular texts. And so, again, coming back to that framework of reading like a writer, when we immerse students in a genre and really think about what makes writing effective, not only are we developing them as writers, but we're also developing them as readers, right? They are beginning to think about writing differently. They're beginning to understand that authors use particular techniques for particular audiences. So depending on what their message is, an author might use different visuals, or an author might use particular words. So again, we're developing students as kind of complete readers and writers, so that they're seeing how reading and writing are connected. And Michelle, I see the media literacy. This is definitely a great way to think about media literacy as well. Okay, so thinking about, I have two questions here, but thinking about these assignments, are there any assignments that you can see yourself either using in your classroom, or kind of thinking about how you could tweak them to make them fit what you're doing? Or are there any other digital tools that you think work well for these assignments? Google Slides, Jamboard, drawing. You know, what's interesting, I come back to PowerPoint when certain schools, certain schools have different products that they use, or if they're using Google Classroom. in certain places, I've only been able to use PowerPoint, and it's amazing everything that you can do on Google Slides or PowerPoint. There are some tools that I absolutely love, but also thinking about the tools that you might have just in your classroom that you're using on a daily basis and thinking about how to become really proficient. Canva, we're going to talk about Canva. That was what I used for the infographics. I really love that. But again, thinking about just the tools that you have and how they could be effective for doing just different things with them. So we talked about reimagining writing. We talked about using modes together in one piece of a composition, right? And how as readers, we can, use multimodal composition to be teaching students to read as writers. So now we're going to talk about revisioning writing. Okay, so what does this actually mean? And transmediation is this big word that we have here. But really what we're talking about is this idea of modes again. So we have visual, we have auditory, we have design, we have gestures, we have any way that we can communicate. When we ask students to engage in transmediation, which sounds fancier than probably is, what we're asking them to do is take a piece of writing that was done in one mode and put it into another mode. So let me show you some examples. And I see in the chat, someone asked about internet safety and also appropriate pictures. So I will say, I really like Pixabay because it shows you at the top which ones you cannot use, which ones have copyright, but then it also shows you free images. But there's definitely, this is part of it, right? Anytime we're working with digital tools, we also have to talk to students about, okay, if you're remixing something, that song doesn't belong to you, or that photo doesn't belong to you. So how do you find content that you can use? So this idea of transmediation, this is one example, and then I'm going to show you an example from a student piece. So again, flash fiction is 500 words or less. It's a very short story. It's usually really engaging and really interesting. I love reading and teaching flash fiction. And then we took, so I was doing with 8th grade students. We took flash fiction that they wrote, and then they had to turn it into hint fiction. And hint fiction is 25 words or less. So it's very, very short. Once they had taken their piece of hint fiction, they then used Animoto and put it into a visual form. So we took a long piece of writing and then we shortened it. And then we took all the words out and just thought about what it would look like in terms of images. So let me show you an example from a 1st grade classroom. So the students in this 1st grade classroom were reading Steve Jenkins, a lot of his books. They're all about animals, and they were reading Animals in Flight. And then you can see they have this little, this is where it says, how did insects begin to fly? That is an example of what is in his book. Then we had what we noticed. These are the things that the 1st grader started to notice. He always starts with a question. Then he answers the question. He describes it. He tells us facts. He compares it to another creature. And then what we were calling high 5 sentences, right? So high 5 sentence, soft, silently, swoop. Okay, so when we use those descriptive words. So the students then chose their own animal, and we have the tarpon, which is a type of fish. And you can see that the student wrote out and has an image of his tarpon. And he was trying to write in the similar style, starting with a question, describing it, trying to use those high 5 sentences. Once the student had the written piece done, then we had students create photo essays. So on this next slide, I'm going to show you his photo essay. Oops, sorry, you don't need to see tarpons again. Okay, now I can't, let's see. Okay, so coming back to this idea of transmediation, and actually Animoto makes that so incredibly easy. So again, the students went to Pixabay, they found images of their animals, they learned how to save their images, okay? And amazingly enough, I mean, the first graders, they're so used to using technology every day that this was sort of nothing for them. And then Animodal allows you just to click and slide. So for even students that, you know, it might be difficult for kindergartner, first grade, second grade to file, click, open, right? But when you can just drag and drop, it makes it really easy. So the students, again, had to think about, okay, so I talked about the fact that they can jump out of the water. I need a picture that shows that they can jump out of the water. Or what would be a picture that shows they're bigger than other fish? So they had to re-see their writing. Now, there were some interesting studies that were done. Kathy Batchelor at Miami University did a study where she had then students go back to their original piece and revise based on that. Okay, so now, could you think of a better word than big? What would be, you know, gigantic, right? So to think about, again, that those high five sentences, that figurative language, but also how this can be a tool for students' original compositions as well, to let them think about how people are interpreting their writing or how they're just using figurative language or descriptive writing. So we can see how transmediation, again, sort of this fancy big word for just thinking about having one piece of writing and reworking it into another piece. And thinking about how then, what does that mean for them as writers? And again, what does it mean for them as readers? Okay, so here are some of the digital tools that I have featured so far, and I've seen sort of a list already, but what other digital tools do you love and why? So I showed, you know, iMovie is great, but not everyone has access to iMovie, so Animoto is fantastic. Canva, Easily is always a great tool. Yes, in fact, you know what, I will just type, it's, I think there's an A there. So it's Pixabay. ThinkLink is a great tool. I really love ThinkLink, especially for, again, evidence-based writing, because in ThinkLink, if you haven't used it, you basically, it's very similar to the idea of hyperlinking, and it takes you right to that direct source. So Chris, that is a great tool for evidence-based writing. Okay. Okay, so you can keep going with thinking about the tools that you use, and we're going to talk a little bit about publishing students' writing and what that actually means and can look like. Oops, sorry about that. Book Creator is a good one. I love Book Creator as well. Okay, so why do we want to publish students' writing? Publishing students' writing can look like a lot of different things. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're publishing it to the entire world. It might be that you're sharing it with parents. It might mean that you're sharing it as a class. So you have a class website where students can post their work. It might mean that you're sharing it very much just with that particular child's parents. So when we say publishing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're putting out to the entire world. But again, when we want to establish is that there is a purpose for writing and that there's an audience for our writing. Because when we establish that there's a purpose, it helps us like think about a frame of mind. We think about, okay, this is why I'm writing this piece. When we think about the audience, it helps us think about, okay, the audience needs to know certain things, or I need to use certain vocabulary words to convey these particular ideas. So they have an increased awareness when we start thinking about who is our audience. Students then become an increased awareness to the purpose. And it also gives us a little bit of ownership, a little bit that sense of writing identity. So blogs are something that we think about all the time. and I love blogs. And so here we go again with our fish, right? And so we can use blogs to have images, and then we can have people respond. And again, here's our reading and writing connection, is that the students are now going back, they're reading the comments and they're thinking, oh, okay, my audience didn't understand this, or my audience really liked this. So the next time I'm going to do these things as a writer. This comes into this idea of how we prepare students for writers. So I put these, I almost had these in one section and I decided to split it apart a little bit, because when we're thinking about preparing students for writers, for writing, we want to think about how often we are teaching students to write and how often we're allowing students to write. So when we have something like a blog where they are consistently writing and publishing their work, we're helping to build their writing stamina. We're preparing them for longer engagement with writing. So we want to teach students how to persist. I know as a writer, there are times I get stuck, right? It's hard. Writing is hard work. But we need to teach students that they can have enough stamina to move through their writing, that they can work through the difficulties of writing, and that they can persist in writing tasks. That increases their abilities as well. So we know that there's this evidence that when writers understand what they're going to be writing, again, they're more prepared. But we have to help engage them in pre-writing and organizing their writing, so that we're thinking about, okay, writers brainstorm, writers outline. We have to help them set goals for their writing. So I always have digital writing notebooks in my classrooms. An idea for a digital writing notebook, a writing notebook is not, it goes back to that writerly identity. It's not something that has to be shared with the entire world, right? It is for students, but it's almost just that way to build their writing stamina. So here's some examples. I've used Penzu. The great thing about Penzu, you could also use Google Docs. It does the same thing, but Penzu allows you to share. So students could share maybe one journal entry with you, or they could share with a classmate. And you can see how they can also incorporate images, and they can make it look like a notebook by using kind of the lined in the background. Google Docs, you know, if you only have Google Docs and Google Slides, certainly that is where you could have your writing notebook. So thinking about every day, starting with writing into the day. So we're going to start for the first 5 minutes. We're going to write into our day. You're going to use your digital notebook. It's a great place where it helps us keep our ideas, so that when we have longer pieces of writing, we can come back and say, okay, what was I already writing about in my notebook? What do I want to come back to? We can also teach students to use these tools for collaborative brainstorming. So I really love Padlet for this. I use Padlet in all of my classes. I've been using it a lot the past 6 months because it's a great collaborative brainstorming tool for students, again, to go back to and say, okay, you know, we were talking about all these things on Padlet. What were some of the interesting things, topics that I could use for my own writing? So this is thinking about, as we prepare students for writing, you know, we want to make sure that they're writing. We want to make sure that they have lots of different things to pull from when they go to write a longer assignment. So often I think we get trapped into, okay, the first semester I'm going to do narrative writing, and then the second 9 weeks I'll teach persuasive, and then the third informational, and then argumentative. And that is great. I mean, I think we have to think about those longer assignments, but we have to have students writing every single day so that when they get to a larger task, it doesn't seem as daunting. Okay, so thinking about this, as a writing teacher, what's one area of digital writing that you're interested in exploring in more depth? Feedback. Feedback. Do you mean teacher feedback to students, or students feedback to one another? Yes. So Ashley, I also agreed when I taught writing, or when I teach writing, but especially when I was teaching high school writing and I had 150 students, thinking about having those daily conversations it can be a little overwhelming and it can be daunting. So the way that I think about feedback and conferences with writing conferences is I don't think about this one big time that I'm going to devote this whole day to writing conferences. I try to think about, and I usually keep track. I have like a notebook where I have students' names down and then like a little check mark, and I check in with students quickly. So can you send me a page from your writing notebook that you really want me to see where you did something really well? Okay. Or can you send me something from a piece of writing that you kind of just, it's like one sentence where you're really stuck or you don't know the words you want to use. And trying to do that efficiently and not thinking about conferencing with students as writers as this big thing that we have to do, but instead using every day to check in with students in their writing. And that's where that comes back to this idea of having students write daily. Writing into the day allows you to do that so that it doesn't necessarily, because trying to talk to 150 students about a piece of writing is very daunting. I saw a note for struggling writers. So I in reading challenges. So I work with a really wide range of students. So I work in schools with a wide range of students that are there. But one of the places that I also work is I work in a juvenile detention facility with those students who school's not always been a place where they can be successful, and they don't always see themselves necessarily as readers and writers. I will say the reading and writing, reading like a writer approach consistently is helpful to those students who writing might be challenging, because you're really scaffolding them. Because if you just tell a student, okay, you're going to write an informational piece and it's going to be 250 words and you need to have sources, that's overwhelming. That's a lot. But when you teach students a particular genre and you talk to them and you show them examples and you write with them and you can deconstruct pieces and you give them a sense of what they need to do, that makes it so much more manageable for students as writers. So I will really say those students who it can be really challenging for, by helping them and immersing them into text and to think about it as a genre and what are the elements of a genre, it gives them a vision, right? So I showed you the picture of the house, right? It allows them not to see this final product that they have to do, but it allows them to see everything underneath that's going to get them there. So definitely I would think about that reading as a writer approach. Now for your students on the other end, it also is very analytical. So it can help students develop as a writer because they can start taking some risks in their writing. They can use different language. They can think about, oh, I'm going to try this hook today because I know a hook is really important. So how do I do these things as a writer? So on both ends, I think the reading as a writer approach can really help develop students kind of all around. And I just sort of want to leave us, I have two last slides to leave us today, but thinking about these genres, because again, we get into this, okay, we have narrative writing and we have informational writing, we have opinion writing. What does that look like in terms of particular genres? So I just have some examples up there so that we can think about narrative writing as not just memoir or, a story, but also comics. Right? Or we can think about how blogs can serve as opinion pieces, or so can photo essays. And then finally, and I will make sure that you can get to this, but I have a link of digital tools that I have used. And so you will see it follows our outline for today. And if you click, say you click on tools for publishing writing, it will give you a list of tools and it will link you to those particular websites that you can use if you're looking for particular digital tools. So I'm just gonna leave it open in the chat and go back to Jen. We covered a lot in, I think, like 50 minutes. But thank you so much for being here. I love to talk about writing. It's so much fun to see what students come up with, to see their voices, to see their thinking. And so thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for the work that you do every day in your classroom, for all the ways that you show up for students. I think over the past, year, we have recognized that teachers are just so incredibly important, and we value you and appreciate you. So thank you for everything that you do.
Wonderful. Everybody, if you can help join me in giving Dr. Pytash a big round of applause. I know that we have all come away with so many new ideas and so many new things that we can consider for our own classroom. I know that a couple of my big takeaways were, I love the term write into our day. What a great way to establish a writing culture in our classroom. And as Dr. Pytash mentioned, making writing a routine, not just something that we have to do at a particular time in the week. So I love that idea. I also love, somebody mentioned this, Dr. Pytash, was when you were talking about infographics, about how incorporating a lot of these ideas is not only helping us to teach writing, but it's also helping our students to learn content. And there's oftentimes the opportunity for us to meet not only our English or our language arts or reading and writing standards, but also our other standards. I think somebody mentioned math, but of course science and the social studies, et cetera. So I'm glad that you pointed that out, and that was another big takeaway. Another big takeaway that I had as I was listening to Dr. Pytash is I haven't been in the classroom for a little bit now. I used to teach first and second grade, but my own children are in school and I see their own writing. And as much as we love writing as educators, I've seen my own children who don't. But when they have these opportunities to embed the type of writing they do outside of the classroom into the classroom, they are so much more motivated. The perfect example that Dr. Pytash gave was including the hypertext into the PowerPoints or into whatever tool that you're using. Those are the things that if I can go back into the classroom, or if I wish I can go back to do better. So it's so exciting to get these ideas, and hopefully we can all transfer those into our workings with our students. So Dr. Pytash, thank you so much for these fabulous ideas. I know that we're all walking away with so many. And thank you also. We were going to leave a little bit of time for some questions, but you've done a great job of answering those questions as we've gone through the presentation. But if there is any additional questions that we want to address in the last couple of minutes, you are welcome to do that. While you are potentially writing anything in the chat box, I just want to make two mentions. First of all, feel free to mark your calendars, everybody. We have another Global Voices presentation coming up in March. And this presentation will feature the art of storytelling from Claire Henderson Venables. And she is a teacher, trainer, writer, and consultant for bilingual schools in Brazil. So more information will be coming out about that. And hopefully you can join us for another really great presentation. And then finally, after our presentation today, we will be taking everybody that was in attendance and putting you in a random drawing for a 1-year subscription to RAS Plus Connected Classroom. If you are selected for that prize, we will be notifying you in email to get your information in order to make sure that you can have access to that product. So with that said, I'd like to again thank Dr. Pytash sincerely for this amazing presentation. I learned so much, and I know that you are all walking away with some great ideas. So thank you very, very much. And we wish you a wonderful day, and thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and actually, good question, Ahmed. can you speak real briefly on how we will give them access to this information, including the site that Christy or Dr. Pytash put on the screen and also the recording?
All the